History of the World by J. M. Roberts. Book 7, The End of the Europeans' World. Chapter 5, The Second World War. More directly, this affected the international situation because of the propaganda which accompanied it. Much of this, no doubt, arose from the deliberate provocation inside Russia of a siege mentality, far from being relaxed. The habit of thinking of the world in terms of US versus them, which had been born in the Marxist dogma and the interventions of 1918 to 1922, was encouraged in the 1930s. As this notion took hold, so outside did the preaching of the doctrine of international class struggle by the Comintern. The reciprocal effect was predictable. The fears of conservatives everywhere were intensified. It became easy to think of any concession to left wing or even mildly progressive forces as a victory for the Bolsheviks. As attitudes thus hardened on the right, so communists were given new evidence for the thesis of inevitable class conflict and revolution. But there was not one successful left wing revolution. The revolutionary danger had subsided rapidly after the immediate post war years. Labour governments peacefully and undramatically ruled Great Britain for part of the 1920s. The second ended in financial collapse in 1931, to be replaced by conservative coalitions which had overwhelming electoral support and proceeded to govern with remarkable fidelity to the tradition of progressive and piecemeal social and administrative reform, which had marked Great Britain's advance into the welfare state. The direction had been followed even further in the Scandinavian countries, often held up for admiration for their combination of political democracy and practical socialism, and as a contrast to communism. Even in France, where there was a large and active communist party, there was no sign that its aims were acceptable to the majority of the electorate even after the Depression. In Germany, the Communist Party before 1933 had been able to get more votes, but it was never able to displace the Social Democrats in control of the working class movement. In less advanced countries than these, communism's revolutionary success was even smaller. In Spain, it had to compete with socialists and anarchists. Spanish conservatives certainly feared it and may have had grounds to fear also, but they felt to be a slide towards social revolution under the republic which was established in 1931. But it was hardly Spanish communism that threatened them. Yet ideological interpretations had great appeal, even to many who were not communists. It was much strengthened by the accession to power of a new ruler in Germany, Adolf Hitler, whose success makes it very difficult to deny him political genius, despite his pursuit of goals which make it difficult to believe him wholly sane. In the early 1920s, he was only a disappointed agitator who had failed in an attempt to overthrow a government, the Bavarian, and who poured out his obsessive nationalism and anti Semitism not only in hypnotically effective speeches, but in a long, shapeless, semi autobiographical book which few people read. In 1933, the National Socialist German Workers' Party, which led Nazi for short, was electorally strong enough for him to be appointed Chancellor of the German Republic. Politically, this may have been the most momentous single decision of the century, for it meant the revolutionizing of Germany, its redirection upon a course of aggression, which ended by destroying the old Europe and Germany too, and that meant a new world. Though Hitler's messages were simple, his appeal was complex. He preached that Germany's troubles had identifiable sources. The Treaty of Versailles was one, the international capitalists were another. The supposedly anti national activities of German Marxists and Jews were others. He also said that the righting of Germany's political wrongs must be combined with the renovation of German society and culture, and that this was a matter of purifying the biological stock of German people by excising its non Aryan components. In 1922, such a message took Hitler a very little way. In 1930, it won him 107 seats in the German parliament, more than the communists, who had 77. The Nazis were already the beneficiaries of economic collapse, and it was to get worse. There were several reasons why the Nazis reaped its political harvest, but one of the most important was that the communists spent as much energy fighting the socialists as their other opponents. This had fatally handicapped the left in Germany all through the 1920s. Another reason was that under the Democratic Republic, anti Semitic feeling had grown. It too was exasperated by economic collapse. Anti Semitism, like nationalism, had an appeal which cut across classes as an explanation of Germany's troubles. Unlike the equally simple Marxist explanation in terms of class war, which naturally antagonized some as well as, it was hoped, attracting others. By 1930, the Nazis showed they were a power in the land. They attracted more support and won backers from those who saw in their street fighting gangs and anti communist insurance, from nationalists who sought rearmament and revision of the Versailles peace settlement, and from conservative politicians who thought that Hitler was a party leader like any other, who might now be valuable in their own game. The maneuvers were complicated, but in 1932, the Nazis became the biggest party in the German parliament, though without a majority of seats. In January 1933, Hitler was called to office in due constitutional form by the President of the Republic. There followed new elections, in which the regime's monopoly of the radio and use of intimidation still did not secure the Nazis a majority of seats. Nonetheless, they had won, supported by some right wing members of the parliament, who joined them to vote special enabling powers to the government. The most important was that of governing by emergency decree. This was the end of parliament and parliamentary sovereignty. Armed with these powers, the Nazis proceeded to carry out a revolutionary destruction of democratic institutions. By 1939, there was virtually no sector of German society not controlled or intimidated by them. The conservatives, too, had lost. They soon found that Nazi interference with the independence of traditional authorities was likely to go very far. Like Stalin's Russia, the Nazi regime rested in large measure on terror used mercilessly against its enemies. It was soon unleashed against the Jews, and an astonished Europe found itself witnessing revivals in one of its most advanced societies of the pogroms of medieval Europe or Tsarist Russia. This was indeed so amazing that many people outside Germany found it difficult to believe that it was happening. Confusion over the nature of the regime made it even more difficult to deal with. Some saw Hitler simply as a nationalist leader bent like an Ataturk upon the regeneration of his country and the assertion of its rightful claims. Others saw him as a crusader against Bolshevism, even when people only thought he might be a useful barrier against it. That increased the likelihood that men of the left would see him as a tool of capitalism. But no simple formula will contain Hitler or his aims. And there is still great disagreement about what these were, and probably a reasonable approximation to the truth is simply to recognize that he expressed the resentments and exasperations of German society in their most negative and destructive forms and embodied them to a monstrous degree. When his personality was given scope by economic disaster, political cynicism, and a favorable arrangement of international forces, he could release these negative qualities at the expense of all Europeans in the long run, his own countrymen included. The path by which Germany came to be at war again in 1939 is complicated. Argument is still possible about when, if ever, there was a chance of avoiding the final outcome. One important moment, clearly, was when Mussolini, formerly wary of German ambitions in Central Europe, became Hitler's ally. After he had been alienated by British and French policy over his Ethiopian adventure, a civil war broke out in Spain when a group of generals mutinized against the left wing republic. Hitler and Mussolini both sent contingents to support the man who emerged there as the rebel leader, General Franco. This, more than any other single fact, gave an ideological color of Europe's divisions. Hitler, Mussolini, and Franco were all now identified as fascist, and Russian foreign policy began to coordinate support for Spain within the Western countries by letting local communists abandon their attacks on other left wing parties and encouraging popular fronts. Thus, Spain came to be seen as a conflict between right and left in its purest form. This was a distortion, but it encouraged people to think of Europe as divided into two camps. British and French governments were by this time well aware of the difficulties of dealing with Germany. Hitler had already in 1935 announced that her rearmament forbidden at Versailles had begun. Until their own rearmament was completed, they remained very weak. The first consequence of this was shown to the world when German troops re entered the demilitarized zone of the Rhineland, from which they had been excluded by the treaties of Versailles. No attempt was made to resist this move. After the civil war in Spain had thrown opinion in Great Britain and France into further disarray, Hitler then seized Austria. The terms of Versailles, which forbade the fusion of Germany and Austria, seemed hard to uphold to the French and British electorates. This could present it as a matter of legitimately aggrieved nationalism. The Austrian Republic had also long had internal troubles. Anschluss, as union with Germany was called, took place in March 1938. In the autumn came the next German aggression, the seizure of the part of Czechoslovakia. Again, this was justified by the spacious claims of self determination. The areas involved were so important that their loss crippled the prospect of future Czechoslovak self defense, but they were areas with many German inhabitants. Memel would follow on the same grounds the next year. Hitler was gradually fulfilling the old dream which had been lost when Prussia beat Austria, the dream of a united Great Germany, defined as all lands of those of German blood. The dismemberment of Czechoslovakia had been something of a turning point. It was achieved by a series of agreements at Munich in September 1938, in which Great Britain and Germany took the main parts. This was the last great initiative of British foreign policy to try to satisfy Hitler. The British Prime Minister was still too unsure of rearmament to resist, but hoped also that the transference of the last substantial group of Germans from alien rule to that of their homeland might deprive Hitler of the motive for further revision of Versailles, a settlement which was now somewhat tattered in any case. He was wrong. because Hitler went on to inaugurate a program of expansion into Slav lands. The first step was the absorption of what was left of Czechoslovakia in March 1939. This brought forward the question of the Polish settlement of 1919. Hitler resented the Polish corridor, which separated East Prussia from Germany and contained Danzig, an old German city given an international status in 1919. At this point, the British government, though hesitatingly, changed tact and offered a guarantee to Poland, Romania, Greece, and Turkey against aggression. It also began a wary negotiation with Russia. Russian policy remains hard to interpret. It seems that Stalin kept the Spanish Civil War going with the support to the Republic as long as it seemed likely to tie up German attention, but then looked for other ways of buying time against the attack from the West, which he always feared. To him, it seemed likely that a German attack on Russia might be encouraged by Great Britain and France, who would see with relief the danger they had so long faced turning against the workers' state. No doubt they would have done. There was little possibility of working with the British or French to oppose Hitler, however, even if they were willing to do so, because no Russian army could reach Germany except through Poland. And this the Poles would never permit. Accordingly, as a Russian diplomat remarked to a French colleague on hearing of the Munich decisions, there was now nothing for it but a fourth partition of Poland. This was arranged in the summer of 1939. After their bitter respective diatribes against Bolshevik Slav barbarism and fascist capitalist exploitation, Germany and Russia made an agreement in August which provided for the division of Poland between them. Authoritarian states enjoy great flexibility in the conduct of diplomacy. Armed with this, Hitler went on to attack Poland. He thus began the Second World War on 1st September 1939. 2 days later, the British and French honored their guarantee to Poland and declared war on Germany. Their governments were not very keen on doing so, for it was obvious that they could not help Poland. That unhappy nation disappeared once more, divided by Russian and German forces about a month after the outbreak of war. But not to have intervened would have meant acquiescing in the German domination of Europe, for no other nation would then have thought British or French support worth having. So, uneasily and without the excitement of 1914, the only two constitutional great powers of Europe found themselves facing a totalitarian regime. Neither their peoples nor governments had much enthusiasm for this role, and the decline of liberal and democratic forces since 1918 put them in a position much inferior to that of the Allies of 1914. But exasperation with Hitler's long series of aggressions and broken promises made it hard to see what sort of peace could be made which would reassure them. The basic cause of the war was, as in 1914, German nationalism. But whereas then Germany had gone to war because it felt threatened, now Great Britain and France were responding to the danger presented by Germany's expansion. They felt threatened this time. To the surprise of many observers and the relief of some, the first 6 months of the war were almost uneventful. Once the short Polish campaign was over, it was quickly plain that mechanized forces and air power were to play a much more important part than between 1914 and 1918. The memory of the slaughter of the Somme and Verdun was too vivid for the British and French to plan anything but an economic offensive. The weapon of blockade, they hoped, would be effective. Hitler was unwilling to disturb them because he was anxious to make peace. This deadlock was only broken when the British sought to intensify the blockade in Scandinavian waters. This coincided remarkably with a German offensive to secure ore supplies, which conquered Norway and Denmark. Its launching on 9th April 1940 opened an astonishing period of fighting. Only a month later, there began a brilliant German invasion, first of the Low Countries and then of France. A powerful armored attack through the Ardennes opened the way to the division of the Allied armies and the capture of Paris. On 22nd June, France signed an armistice with the Germans. By the end of the month, the whole European coast from the Pyrenees to the North Cape was in German hands. Italy joined in on the German side 10 days before the French surrender. A new French government at Vichy broke off relations with the Great Britain after the British had seized or destroyed French warships they feared might fall into German hands. The Third Republic effectively came to an end with the installation of a French marshal, a hero of the First World War, as head of state. With no ally left on the continent, Great Britain faced a worse strategic situation by far than that in which she had struggled against Napoleon. This was a huge change in the nature of war. But Great Britain was not quite alone. There were the dominions, all of which had entered the war on her side, and a number of governments in exile from the overrun continent. Some of these commanded forces of their own, and Norwegians, Danes, Dutchmen, Belgians, Czechs, and Poles were to fight gallantly, often with decisive effect, in the years ahead. The most important exiled contingents were those of the French, but at this stage they represented a faction within France, not its legal government. A general who had left France before the armistice and was condemned to death in absentia was their leader, Charles de Gaulle. He was recognized by the British only as leader of the Free French, but saw himself as constitutional legatee of the Third Republic and the custodian of France's interests and honor. He soon began to show an independence which was in the end to make him the greatest servant of his country since Clemenceau. De Gaulle was immediately important to the British because of uncertainties about what might happen to parts of the French Empire, where he hoped to find sympathizers who wished to join him to continue to fight. This was one way in which the war was now extended geographically. This was also a consequence of Italy's entry into the war, since her African possessions and the Mediterranean sea lanes now became operational areas. Finally, the availability of Atlantic and Scandinavian ports to the Germans meant that what was later called the Battle of the Atlantic, the struggle by submarine, surface and air attack to sever or wear down British sea communications, was now bound to become much fiercer. Immediately, the British Isles faced direct attack. The hour had already found the man to brace the nation against such a challenge. Winston Churchill, after a long and checkered political career, had become Prime Minister when the Norwegian campaign collapsed because no other man commanded support in all the parties in the House of Commons. To the coalition government, which he immediately formed, he gave vigorous leadership, something hitherto felt to be lacking. More important than this, he called forth in his people, whom he could address by radio, qualities they had forgotten they possessed. It was soon clear that only defeat after direct assault was going to get the British out of the war. This was even more certain after a great air battle over southern England in August and September had been won by the British science in the form of radar and the Royal Air Force. For a moment, Englishmen knew the pride and relief of the Greeks after Marathon. It was true, as Churchill said in a much quoted speech, that never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few. This victory made a German seaborne invasion impossible, though a successful one was always unlikely. It also established that the Great Britain could not be defeated by air bombardment alone. The islands had a bleak outlook ahead, but this victory changed the direction of the war, for it was the beginning of a period in which a variety of influences turned German attention elsewhere. In December 1940, planning began for a German invasion of Russia. After that winter, Russia had made further gains in the west, apparently with an eye to securing a Glacis against a future German attack. A war against Finland gave her important strategic areas. The Baltic republics of Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia were swallowed in 1940. Bessarabia, which Romania had taken from Russia in 1918, was now taken back together with the northern Bukovina. In the last case, Stalin was going beyond Tsarist boundaries. The German decision to attack Russia arose in part because of the disagreements about the future direction of Russian expansion. Germany sought to keep Russia away from the Balkans and the Straits. It was also aimed at demonstrating by a quick overthrow of Russia that further British war making was pointless. But there was also a deep personal element in the decision. Hitler had always sincerely and fanatically detested Bolshevism and maintained that the Slavs, a radically inferior group, should provide Germans with living space and raw materials in the East. His was a last perverted vision of the old struggle of the Teuton to impose Western civilization on the Slav East. Many Germans responded to such a theme. It was to justify more appalling atrocities than any earlier crusading myth. In a brief spring campaign, which provided an overture to the coming clash of the Titans, the Germans overran Yugoslavia and Greece, with the second of which Italian forces had been unhappily engaged since October 1940. Once again, British arms were driven from the mainland of Europe. Crete, too, was taken by a spectacular German airborne assault. Now all was ready for Barbarossa, as the great onslaught on Russia was named after the medieval emperor who had led the Third Crusade and had been drowned in the course of it. The attack was launched on 22nd June 1941 and had huge early successes. Vast numbers of prisoners were taken and the Russian armies fell back hundreds of miles. The German advance guard came within a few miles of entering Moscow. But that margin was not quite eliminated by Christmas. The first successful Russian counterattacks had announced that, in fact, Germany was pinned down. German strategy had lost the initiative. If the British and Russians could hold on and if they could keep in alliance with one another, then, failing a radical technical modification of the war by the discovery of new weapons of great power, their access to American production would inexorably increase their strength. This did not, of course, mean that they would inevitably defeat Germany, only that they might bring her to negotiate terms. The American president had believed since 1940 that in the interest of the United States, Great Britain had to be supported up to the limits permitted by his own public and the law of neutrality. In fact, he went well beyond both at times. By the summer of 1941, Hitler knew that all intents and purposes the United States was an undeclared enemy. A crucial step had been the American Lend Lease Act of March that year, which, after British assets in the United States had been liquidated, provided production and services to the Allies without payment. Soon afterwards, the American government extended naval patrols and the protection of its shipping further eastwards into the Atlantic. After the invasion of Russia came a meeting between Churchill and Roosevelt, which resulted in a statement of shared principles, the Atlantic Charter, in which the leaders of one nation at war and another formerly at peace spoke together of the needs of a post World War after the final destruction of the Nazi tyranny. This was a long way from isolationism and was the background to Hitler's second fateful but foolish decision of 1941, a declaration of war on the United States on 11th December after a Japanese attack on British and American territories 4 days earlier. Hitler had promised the Japanese to do this. The war thus became global. The British and American declarations of war on Japan might have left two separate wars to rage, with only Great Britain engaged in both. Hitler's action threw away the chance that American power might have been kept out of Europe and deployed only in the Pacific. Few single acts have so marked the end of an epoch, for this announced the eclipse of European affairs. Europe's future would now be settled not by her own efforts but by the two great powers of her flanks, the United States and Soviet Union.